Laurence Tosi, co-founder of WestCap Group, former CFO of Blackstone and Airbnb, and Peter Hébert, co-founder of Lux. Both were in the thick of everything that happened. Tosi and I did a podcast as it was all unfolding. We can take stock of that. So yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, when did the crisis start for you both?
Well, the crisis started in a way that I didn't necessarily appreciate. But I had a friend, I was just telling LT before this, that it was probably November or December of 22, who came out to visit me from New York, and he's, a hedge fund investor, long focused on the banking sector. And he said to me, like, "What do you think about SVB?" And I said, what do you mean? What do I think about SVB? He's like, "Aren't you concerned?" And I said, "About what? About the loan book? About, it's venture, it goes ups and down cycles." He's like, "No, about their duration issue." And I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" I'm like, "Don't you understand how this works? People have stayed with SVB for decades. This is how it will be forever." And I kind of brushed it off. But it had been an issue that we had been hearing about, going back to that November, December period of time, but also in the beginning of last year, more so in New York among kind of public market investors who had identified this issue and talked about it. And when things started to accelerate, I had already been aware of it. So I had some background. I just never thought that that would be something that, to the earlier panel talking about kind of bank runs, that would actually impact human psychology, which I see as obviously the accelerant here.
So I'll give a little dated stuff. So in 2000, I was at Merrill Lynch, eventually Chief Operating Officer of Banking and Trading, so I saw what that looked like. That wasn't much fun. 2008, I was at Blackstone. I was one of the managing partners. And so we had started to tell our portfolio companies about a year before that things were going to get dark quickly. I thought the government, frankly, was too late in raising rates, and I thought they moved too fast. And inflation was going to drag them to a level that we thought. And I'd seen now 2 times before regional banking stress. So one of the central tenets of what we were telling our portfolio companies even a year before was we need to be really careful with where your cash was. We centralize operations in our portfolio, and so we knew it and we'd seen it. I'm looking at my partner Jeff Mullen, who was the treasurer of Airbnb when we went through the pandemic. So we were a group that was very accustomed to shocks to the system. And we very quickly started working on strategies, and we could see it just was going to happen. When you're going to have that type of rate shock, it's going to hit the regional banks, and it's going to take some time. And so that's when we started getting worried.
And just so we say it out loud, like the core problem with SVB, like let's articulate it. Like it was sort of 2 things happening at once. Them being sort of dependent on Silicon Valley, which was booming in a low interest rate environment, and then holding on to financial products that suffered as interest rates came up. Is that how you would put it?
I think that's fair. We actually, that's exactly right. And it was concentration risk against a certain sector. And apparently, in the end, it looked like they were overexposed to long-term rates. We were very worried about that. So we only had one portfolio company that had exposure to SVB at the time everything happened. And frankly, that was by design.
I was going to say something that's slightly different, which is, and LT will surely correct me if I'm wrong here, but in many ways, like you think about the pandemic, money surged into the venture capital asset class. People like us and others put it and farmed it out there to companies, and that would find its way into some deposit, and generally, more often than not, SVB, and they had this huge influx of cash. And then they had to figure out what to do with it. And they put it into highly interest rate sensitive government securities. It wasn't
seemingly very safe.
Seemingly very safe. That was the big problem, was lending the US government money, or at least in the duration of which they were lending. And then I'd say another thing that complicated matters, not just the concentration risk of highly gossip-oriented, hyper-connected individuals in the technology, venture capital world in Silicon Valley, but also what has changed certainly from when he was at Blackstone and I started my career at Lehman Brothers and looking at 2008 is social media, free-flowing information transmitted at the speed of light, Twitter, banking apps that people can immediately withdraw so that it wasn't like going down to Jimmy Stewart's bank and having to wait in line. And all those things, if you think about what causes sheer panic in a very abbreviated period of time, will lead to that.
Well, just to, take stock of what's been reported and not, Green Oak's a very smart investor, was clearly warning their people. USV was warning their people. Seems like Founders Fund, Peter Thiel was like directly communicating with people, warnings. Then I think there was like some huge Andreessen portfolio company thread where everybody's sharing notes, and like it all just spirals out. Or like, how did this message get out so fast? And I guess the real question that we'll never know the definitive answer was did SVB fail because of a bank run or because of their duration risk strategy?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Eric. I think Steve makes a good point. Particularly unprepared for the velocity of the change in movement of capital was the government. That was the big surprise. So we will talk a little bit about how they reacted. So I think the velocity of the change was something we'd never seen before, because exactly as Steve just said, we didn't have these things in 2008. Pete, sorry. I was thinking.
Steve Young. He was
Steve Young.
About,
that's what I was thinking. Yes. But as Peter said, like I think that things moved faster. The government wasn't ready, and the banks weren't ready, and that is definitely a contributing factor.
And you were You were on like a venture advisory board to SVB. Touch on like, what SVB is and was to the Valley like pre-crisis.
In many ways, it harkened back to a different era of banking where it wasn't just relationship, but people would, in effect, look you in your eye and say, you are worthy of credit, right? It was this old school approach, almost Beaver Cleaver-esque. And that world has obviously changed, and maybe it was belated, and maybe that accrued to the benefit of quote-unquote insiders or those with the relationships. Today, obviously, more lending decisions are made algorithmically, and I think probably there are a lot of people in this room that is exactly what they want to be doing and think it should be done. But we had a very cozy relationship, or Silicon Valley did for decades, and Lux did as well, where there was trust on both sides. It was underwriting the underwriters. They would ask the question, do you stand behind this company? And if we said yes, they'd say, that's good enough for us. That's no longer, despite what most people say, the way that things are done. Relationships still do matter. The relative position of the equity capital investors behind the company does factor into a lending decision, but it's no longer as simple as it was under that SVB construct.
And we'll dig in more to present day today, but do you think venture capital firms betrayed Silicon Valley Bank?
It's something that we talked about a lot at the time and even after, and just thinking about this, but the reality is, like, we were aware of all of the issues, and it wasn't lost on us, but we also felt it's not like a placing myself on some moral high ground, but we also felt if we communicated and said, here's a risk, it's the equivalent of yelling fire in the theater.
So you were more on the stay.
I was, when we can talk about the day and even the weekend after, which I think is fascinating, and very few people have actually talked about it in a public forum, but I was of the perspective that if people held together, held strong, and I'll use like the Braveheart analogy, it's like hold, then you could have resisted those market forces. By the end of the day, on Thursday, that was lost. Like that you had reached a point of no return. But I did believe if people were rather, it's not, and again, I understand it's risks. If you're trying to, manage risks, reduce them, you want your companies to have access to capital. You don't want to be the last one there.
It's a pure like game theory.
It is absolute
problem.
Game theory. It's like, yes.
But there was so much. There was a time where it felt like there was a good cabal, or like the VCs could sort of collude when necessary to like protect something, and the inability of the VCs to work together and say, no, we're not going to bail on Silicon Valley sort of in some ways speaks to how big it's become. Anyway, LT.
No, I was just going to mention there's two super unique factors in what happened. One is Silicon Valley Bank was a huge presence in the Valley. I mean, they touched every company. There's not a company that they weren't calling on, so they were very pervasive, and that's unusual in any industry you have that kind of dominant market share. The second one is a lot of private companies are underdeveloped when it comes to risk and treasury. I mean, I can remember when I got to Airbnb, we had $1 billion on the balance sheet. It was sitting in an account at PayPal, earning zero. That's not the antithesis of treasury. And I looked at it, I was like, well, we can definitely make money off of that. So you had a lot of companies that weren't, because when you're private, you don't really have the need for a very sophisticated risk or treasury system because you're not supposed to be hoarding cash and earning money off it. Add that, and then maybe the third factor is the VC community and the growth equity community is very, very close. Very close. Because you have portfolios, man, how many companies do you have, Pete?
More than 275, probably?
That's 275 emails that go out very quickly. So that kind of, those little hub and spoke models of the VC companies can get out there quickly. So those three factors were super unique and created something that this country had never seen before.
And so the days, when did you say, okay, fine, get out? Or like when we talked, you were helping at least one company move money out. Like what was that like? And how much was it sort of a relationship game where if you knew the right banker?
So this SVB people won't want to hear this, but we were away from them for about a year. And the only company we had that had cash with them was a company we had signed a deal to invest in that hadn't actually closed with yet. And we hadn't gotten to Treasury. And so then we moved quickly, obviously, to move it. You know, there's a difference between money market accounts and general deposits. Like that was one simple thing you could do. You didn't need to go running out of the bank. You could just move it into a money market deposit, and that's it's not insured, but it's not touchable. No matter what happens, you're not opposite the bank credit. So that's what we did. We just moved quickly. There were some other companies that we had relationships with that came for advice, and we spent, I guess, probably a week just making sure that everybody was set up and they were in a good spot, and we were kind of teaching them the strategies of how to limit the risk. But it came very, very fast in the end.
And so, you're on team hold. When do you say we're not anymore?
Yeah, so we thought we do think about risk management. We take it seriously, and we thought that we had done all the necessary things in advance to make sure that we were hedged. The reality is we had, as kind of frontline banks, SVB and First Republic, and then money center banks, we had JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley at that point in time. And we thought that that was fairly diversified. We had the ability to move accounts around. We can talk about the correlation with First Republic and SVB. It's a whole nother topic. But to your point on Thursday, I'd heard, I guess it was the Wednesday night, they kind of announced that they were raising capital. Normally, you announce the deal in hand, and maybe that was General Atlantic that they had announced that they were going to raise the money from. I can't remember the specifics.
Right, they had that call with VCs to reassure them, and it came off.
Well, there were a couple calls in prior weeks where people started to hear things. We had, again, been hearing for months, but people here, it took a while to reach the West Coast. New York money had been, crossover funds had been pulling out in the weeks earlier. We'd started to hear those kinds of signals. But then Thursday morning, I remember the stock gapped 50% lower, whatever. It started moving, and then people started looking at that. And the CEOs, remember, it's I told you, I think we have 275 active portfolio companies. They are not focused on treasury, right? They're trying to build rockets. They're trying to build robots. Even their CFO, hopefully now they have gotten more sophisticated, but this is just not a risk that they are pondering. And so I remember I was at a meeting earlier in the morning, came back to the office at 10, and we had kind of an all hands discuss this. And at that point in time, it was team hold. And then it was from that 10 o'clock period to call it 2 p.m. Of course, the markets close out here at 1 p.m. And I realized this is probably inappropriate reference, but it was like the banking equivalent of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was over that 3-hour period.
Colorful, yeah.
It was absolute sheer terror. We started getting first emails, then it was calls. And then people were saying, what should we do? People were wiring money because they were asking for board approval to wire money out of the account. They were wiring money because they didn't have other credit or banking relationships set up.
And a big risk was, people are obligated to make payroll, and if they can't
there was the whole payroll. That was I can't remember what we called it. That was over the weekend. People called it maybe the Monday morning problem or whatever it was, because it was around the 15th or whatever it was. It would fund maybe the 13th and be paid out on the 15th. But we had portfolio companies wiring millions of dollars to their personal account, trying to do everything CYA and just letting people know they're doing this for the right reason. We had that Thursday evening.
You mean you have founders saying, I'm moving all our company money into my personal
Yeah, because they only
bank
had one account, and they had no backup, and there was no ability, all the other banks were getting deluged. We had companies with wires that were hundreds of millions of dollars out of checking or money market that were nowhere to be found. At the end of day, Thursday, Friday, could not be located. They were in the ether somewhere. But it was sheer chaos, panic on behalf of not just us as a firm, but all of these people out there who were just desperately just trying to run their business and never thought about this.
I do want to talk about First Republic. I mean, SVB was so fast that was the trauma, but FRB was a super important Silicon Valley bank. I'm going to give you a hard time. We did a podcast, and I think you were sort of cheering for them also to be okay, but you didn't necessarily think they were going to fail. What is your distillation of what happened with FRB?
Well, one comment about what Pete just said. it'll always be a mystery to me how it was that SVB sold off and took the $1.8 billion loss before they had lined up the equity. I never understand how that happened. We saw that, and I saw what was happening. I was like, that's not good. That's not good. First Republic, I mean, it's a bank I know very well. We bought the bank when I was at Merrill. I tried it again when I was at Blackstone, so I've been around that management team. A lot of respect for them. We were big clients. Investment grade business should be very uncorrelated to SVB. They don't have the same type of risk. I didn't think it would happen. And in the end, I guess a bank run's a bank run. I mean, just think about this fact. 3 of the top 30 banks vanished in the last year. That caused $530 billion worth of losses. There was $526 billion of losses in the total great financial crisis. That's what just happened. And I just didn't think it would carry. But when the government didn't react, when the Silicon Valley Bank went out on Friday morning, what happened by Sunday afternoon, we'll be talking about for decades, because the government didn't move, they weren't ready. Pete and I were just talking about in the conversations you were having with Treasury, they were completely unaware of the impact of that was having, and all the rest of the banks were under pressure. And I'll never understand.
You're complaining about like 12-hour difference between when they would have reacted?
It was 10, I think, if I remember the numbers right, it was 10 o'clock on Friday morning, and Treasury didn't make an announcement about a kind of a half-hearted backstop until Sunday afternoon. That period basically told everyone in business in the United States that your deposits aren't safe. That's what the message, that's not what they intended to say, but that's what they said.
Do you agree with that?
100%. There's so many different important things, and we'll go into the weekend, which were, to me, fascinating. One, Silicon Valley Bank, despite the outsized presence here, was relatively unknown in D.C., and certainly even amongst major New York City money center banks. There were conversations that I had, Saturday morning, someone who's actually a great supporter, but still banking, financial services house member, and I tried to reach out to him Friday night, spoke to him on Saturday morning. I go, what do you know about SVB? He's like, I think they have some crypto exposure. I'm like, oh no, okay.
Who is this? Who is it?
Not going to share, but he's actually a very strong supporter during this. But DC and the politics were unfortunate in terms of the naming of the bank, right? It was literally like the equivalent of Nancy Pelosi banking enterprises.
Oh yeah, the rich Democrats, even worse. Yeah, exactly.
And that was like we've talked about this, but I figured that we would have strong support from Silicon Valley, like Ro Khanna, who both of us know, and others. But I quickly first started to fear that there was a banking contagion, because that weekend I remember in LA, which is not Silicon Valley, at a First Republic branch, there was a line around the block of people trying to withdraw money from First Republic. That was something that I used when speaking to Republican congressmen and senators, trying to tell them basically, and some of them specifically said, why should I care? Who cares? You know, it doesn't matter to my constituents. And I said, well, respectfully, imagine in Kentucky if any of these other regional banks with $250,000 limits, why would you keep it there and not in, it was a GSIB bank?
Right.
Why would anyone, he's like, well, my constituents don't have $250,000. I said, all right, fair. All right, let me think about how do I recast this. But still, the fear of regional banking contagion, to me, was the strong one that weekend. And I think that was the only thing that got the federal government to move, because like Treasury was not talking about it on Thursday, FDIC was on top of it, but you also had the administration, the White House, didn't want to touch this, did not want to look at this.
So to sort of distill this, it's like, okay, the government does come in for SVB, but not so fast that we're like, oh, they're really backing banks. And so that creates some of the room for FRB to fail, because there isn't the confidence that the government necessarily will step up. I want to get to the present day, so just a quick...
It's the domino effect. We all saw it in 2008. It was the same thing. First you had Bear, then you had Lehman, immediately after you had the sale of Merrill. The dominoes fall faster, and so I think people pattern recognized, Eric. They were like, well, if that goes down, then it's got to be
We had Signature, of course, crypto.
Interestingly, and I'm looking at John Shrewsbury, who's here, who was the CFO of Wells Fargo for a long time. Nobody was worried about the big banks. It was all focused on the little banks. They were like, okay, we solved the big banks in 2008, but what about the regional banks? And that's why I think it created the panic, the domino effect.
All right. And it was mob justice, by the way, because you looked at, I remember watching Bloomberg during that period of time, and it was whoever's next, right? So it's like a mob going around with a baseball bat, like, who is next? And so that's even, like, fortunately, even though there's been some discussion around, was it New York Community Bank or Commerce Bank, which has large commercial real estate exposure, people are looking for the next domino to fall, and you have an entire group of people, generally hedge fund managers, short sellers, everyone's looking to identify, call that person out, and it's an easy trade. It's easy money to be made, and so people do it.
All right, a lot of bankers on stage. What is your sort of straight talk of the competitive dynamic between the banks right now for venture funds and startups business?
I think the model's going to change, Eric. And I think that the idea that the VCs will always be there to back their companies as kind of a soft backstop is going to change. So I think credit's presence in Silicon Valley is going to get a lot tighter for a long time.
So less relationship, more just shopping for rates, and less trusting VCs and more.
It's a little bit like the mortgage companies that you don't read about anymore. Remember the ones that like started the whole fall in 2008? There's no Countrywide anymore. It's a little bit like that. I think it'll get much smaller.
You agree with that?
I think there's going to be kind of mainstream banks that will serve this ecosystem, and I think you've seen a lot of great people from SVB and FRB go to other banks. There will be competition. I think it's probably going to be segmented on product, so it could be, hardware as a service, loans, specialization, life sciences, you go to this specific bank. It used to just be, for the most part, if the is always similar and they were always better, just stay with SVB. I think it will change, but I do think it's probably positive in the long term for the ecosystem, even if credit conditions will tighten for a very long time.
Because of competition?
Because of competition. I think a lot of other people probably tried to get in, and you saw groups like Comerica for years is trying to really work in, never really worked. First Republic built, and I know Sam's here, a prominent group with Samir and others, But I do think it will be more banks providing more services, but credit conditions, again, not as favorable as they were pre-SVB crisis.
All right, we'll take a question.
Hi there, Anthony Steele from Steele Comms. Speaking of lessons learned, I'm curious as to your thoughts on whether if SVB had communicated better and more effectively from the get-go, or whether a run could have been avoided. And by that I mean issuing their press release that they were looking to raise cash, spooked investors, spooked creditors. There was not a lot of effective conveying of the rationale behind that, particularly with Silvergate that had just gone. And then there was seemed to be a void online of communication from leadership as to why we're doing this. And when people say, hey guys, don't worry, it's okay, don't panic, everybody panics.
Yeah, great question.
Yes. It's funny. If First Republic did the same thing, they were very quiet. I just think you're so constrained running a public company. I just think there's so few things you can do and you can say. And when a run comes, I just think it's like a tidal wave. And tidal waves don't beg forgiveness.
But we're not going to get Elon-style banks. I mean, I do think, in Silicon Valley, that style of Twitter persona is taking over. And if you're going to bank Silicon Valley, being in the mix, or is that naive? Is just impossible for bankers?
I just think if you're running a regulated bank, I just think it's so hard for you to just come out and go, everything's fine. And actually they did, and they tried to assuage concerns, but I think that just fueled the flames. And I just think it's impossible to be able to communicate your way out of it. The government should have been the one communicating, I think. They should have come up with that plan before they seized SVB and said, this is what we're going to do to temporarily calm this thing down and backstop it. And they turned it into a political issue and just said, not too bad.
And by the way, just something to really quickly add, I had heard, and it could just be total rank speculation, that there was a large money center bank that before things went totally downhill that wanted to buy SVB, and that the US government, extending to the White House, but Treasury, FDIC, did not want that. Why? They didn't want greater concentration in the banking system. So as I said, that weekend, it became clear to me, only through a handful of conversations, they're not going to be helpful. Why? Because there's a very powerful faction, not just in the administration, but Democratic Senate, that do not want to see the big get bigger. And so that actually, I think, served as a huge headwind to a constructive solution.
Awesome. I'm Allie Rode from Outset Capital. Thank you both for joining. Thanks, Eric, for having us here. And I want to get a little bit more tactical, which is, where are you guys telling your portfolio companies to put their money now? And specifically SVB, for Citizens, FRB with JP Morgan. Also want to call out the Mercury, Brex, ARC, others of the world, which are, of course, they're not actually banks. They're using mostly Evolve and Choice. I ask this of both of you, but maybe specifically a little bit more Laurence, who called SVB, maybe a little bit less FRB. So what do people do now?
So it's an interesting question. Out of every damaging thing that happens in the Valley, one of the beautiful things is we figure out how to fix it right? The innovation sometimes spurred fastest things when things don't go right. So we're actually, I think what's going to happen right now, we're seeing a lot of investment in treasury systems and risk systems. Steve Helmbrecht's here is the CEO of Treasury 4. That's an example of a platform that's going into private companies and saying, break up your deposits. You shouldn't be concentrated anywhere. You should have the systems and process, and part of it's systems and process. That's why these CEOs were actually wiring money to their own accounts, because they couldn't open accounts quick enough. I think what you'll see is you'll see a big leap forward in the capital that's being invested, in the technology it takes to properly assess, manage your risk, and diversify your deposits.
Okay, great, but they still have to have deposits somewhere. So
Yeah.
where do they go?
So the answer would be, I mean, what we did before this is we looked at the ratings of the banks. And so we don't have any of our portfolio companies in any non-investment grade banks. Silicon Valley Bank was not an investment grade bank, period. I don't want to offend anybody, but not on our risk list. I know, John, you had a question.
It was just a comment on the idea that a big bank would have come in to bail them out. There's a 10% deposit cap for market share for big banks in this country. So absent an assisted transaction, they couldn't have proposed in the private market to solve that. Now, when JP Morgan came in for First Republic, that was assisted. They said, go ahead and do it. That seemed very unlikely for the reasons that you mentioned.
Right,
So
I think they
that's, by the way, that's
communicated
John
they were not.
Shrewsbury, was the CFO.
They were not
of
willing
Wells.
to assist, right? I don't know at what point in time, if that was I think it was shortly thereafter, before there was the bridge bank, that they communicated we're not willing to assist for some period of time. But you would know better.
We could do this all day, and thank you so much for being our truth tellers. I'm sure people will pin you down in the crowd and get other takes. Peter, LT, thanks so much. We're going to hear
Eric, thank you.
from JP Morgan. So
Thank you.
Yeah.